Hey, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to be pulling the tire, the swing arm, exhaust, and the rear shock so that we can get into the shock and we can service it. Now that we've got the shock out, I can actually inspect it and make sure that it's not leaking, and it actually looks really good. It doesn't look like it's leaking, it's just really dirty. From all the chain, lube, and road grime, cleaning both of these components are going to greatly improve its performance on the track. Now with the shock removed, we can move on to rebuilding the shock. First, we'll need to measure the preload of the spring, as well as measuring the number of clicks on the rebound adjuster, seen here, and also measure out the number of clicks on the high speed and low speed adjusters on the compression side of the shock. Recording these numbers will help us to get the shock back to the proper settings that the bike was at before the shock was removed and disassembled. Once the spring has been removed, it's always a very good idea to stroke the shock and feel what it feels like before removing any of the nitrogen from the shock. This will give you a good baseline as to what the shock was like before and after. Removing the nitrogen is very important. Shocks can be quite dangerous if you take them apart without taking the nitrogen out. When we disassembled this shock, there was still nitrogen on the wrong side of the IFP, or internal floating piston. That's the seal between the oil and the nitrogen. In this case, nitrogen has gotten into the oil. This can be caused by a low pressure on the wrong side of the IFP, allowing the nitrogen to seep through the seal and into the other side of the shock. After removing the reservoir cap, there's a tech tip. You can use a spoke off of an old dirt bike rim, which a lot of times will thread into the IFP, allowing it much easier to remove the IFP without any other special tools. Next, drain the oil and clean the shock for reassembly. Grease all the O-rings for the IFP, shock body seal head, as well as the reservoir cap. Applying grease to these O-rings will keep them from being damaged upon reassembly. Fill the shock body side of the shock with oil and allow it to bleed through into the reservoir. This will allow air to bypass through the valves and help bleed the shock. Fill the reservoir to the top and insert the IFP, pressing it down to push any more air bubbles through the compression valving. Insert the shock rod, wiggling as you install it and tapping with a soft blow hammer. This will get any of the air bubbles within the valve stack to come out so that we do not have any kind of air trapped in the oil upon assembly. Thread the seal head down, making sure that there is no room for air inside the shock. Tighten down the seal head. Reinstall the reservoir cap and clip. Now fill the shock with the proper amount of nitrogen and we're completed rebuilding the shock. Now that we have the shock reserviced with oil and nitrogen and everything set back to the specs that it was at before we started, we can put this back in, and the swing arm is also cleaned and the bushings and bearings are all reserviced with fresh grease. The swing arm is now ready to be installed and we can get the back end of this bike back together. Alright, small tech tip. When you go to install the chain and sprockets on these things, you got to set up your chain tension. Chain tension for this bike is calling for 20 to 30 millimeters of chain slack. Measuring the chain slack from the center of the swing arm, we press up and measure the highest it goes to. In this case, it's 20 millimeters. And all the way down, this one's showing 60 millimeters. That means we have a 40 millimeter chain slack, which is too loose. We need to tighten it up. Tighten the chain adjuster and remeasure. Putting light pressure up on the chain. We're at 20 millimeters. Now 50. That's 30. That's maximum amount of slack. Give it one more little turn. Now we're at 25 millimeters, dropping down to about 52 millimeters, sorry, which gives us a 27 millimeter chain slack. We'll keep it right there. The next tip is using a wire. You can actually measure a more accurate alignment of the rear wheel. Measuring from the center of the swing arm to the center of the axle. In this case, I'll use a marker. Usually it's best to have an O-ring on this shaft. You mark it there. So now I know that's the exact distance from the swing arm to the center of the axle. Measure that comparing the other side and make sure that the axle is the same distance from the swing arm back to the axle. And you will guarantee that that wheel is traveling center to the bike. That axle nut to spec using the proper cotter pin size, cotter pin it in place, and we're all done with this job.